Hey there, fellow horse lovers. Welcome back to the Daily Ride podcast. My name is Morgan. I am your host, and today I'm diving back into United States history, specifically the Civil War, to talk about Ulysses S. Grant's counterpart, Robert E. Lee, and his horse, Traveler. The Daily Ride podcast directly supports True Heart Healing, my nonprofit organization dedicated to provide equine-assisted therapeutic services. Our aim is to support veterans, active duty service members, children with disabilities and life-altering illnesses, and their families to build stabilizing relationships, partner with horses, leverage the joy of equine companionship, find hope, and discover purpose. To help support our mission, head to www.the-daily-ride.com to make a donation. Trueheart and I greatly appreciate your support. In a previous episode in this podcast, we explored the history of Ulysses S. Grant, President of the United States, who was deeply affected by his relationship with his horses and horsemanship across his life. During the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant's counterpart was well known as Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee also had a similar relationship with horses, and specifically with one horse, his heart horse, if you will, named Traveler. But just like Ulysses S. Grant, let's start at the beginning with Robert E. Lee. Lee was born on January 19th, 1807, and Lee grew up with a strong sense of duty to country and a deep connection to the land that his family lived on. His father was a Revolutionary War hero known as Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee, and he instilled in Robert a love of horses and an appreciation for the partnership that horses have with humans. Lee had a reputation for discipline and tactical brilliance that preceded him at West Point. Like Ulysses S. Grant, he attended West Point and he received no demerits during his time there. He graduated in 1829 and he served with distinction in the United States Army, particularly during the Mexican-American War, a war in which Ulysses S. Grant also fought. But his personal life was shaped by as much of his love of family and home as by his military career. While both Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant were deeply affected by horses and both attended West Point, they didn't know each other well while they were there. Lee graduated several years before Grant did, meaning that they probably didn't interact with each other much during their time at West Point. Lee graduated in 1829, while Grant didn't graduate until 1843. They possibly met during the Mexican-American War. Some accounts mention that there was a single meeting between Lee and Grant during the war. But even if they did meet at West Point or during the Mexican-American War, there's no evidence suggesting that they were ever close friends or had any significant interaction with each other. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Lee was faced with a significant moral dilemma. He personally opposed the secession of the Confederate States from the Union, and he was personally opposed to the idea of slavery. However, his loyalty to his state of Virginia and his family outweighed his allegiance to the Union. As he assumed command of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, he became a pretty polarizing figure during the war. Yet, throughout all the chaos that war can bring, he had one constant in his life, and that was his horse, Traveler. Traveler was born in Greenbrier County, Virginia, which is now West Virginia. He was born in 1857, and he was a gray American saddlebred gelding. He was originally named Jeff Davis, like Ulysses S. Grant, who also had named a horse Jeff Davis that was a nod to Jefferson Davis, who would later lead the Confederate Army. His breeder, Andrew Johnston, recognized early on that this horse was special. He had a silvery coat that gleamed like the moon, and Traveler stood 16 hands tall. He was built for speed, stamina, and had a lot of endurance. It was Traveler's steady gait and bold spirit that eventually caught the eye of Major Thomas Brown, who purchased him for $175, which in those days was a lot of money for a horse. He renamed him Greenbrier in honor of where he was born, but fate had other plans for Traveler. When Lee eventually encountered Traveler in 1861, he was smitten with him. Traveler's size, his strength, and his demeanor were ideal for being a war horse. By 1862, Lee had purchased Traveler for $200, renaming him Traveler, a name that reflected his tireless energy and how sure-footed he was. In fact, had written about Traveler at the time. He said, quote, "He was greatly admired in camp for his rapid, springy walk, his high spirits, bold carriage, and his muscular strength. He needed neither whip nor spur, and would walk his 5 or 6 miles in an hour over the rough mountain roads of Western Virginia with his rider sitting firmly in the saddle and holding him in check by a tight rein. Such vim and eagerness did he manifest to go right ahead so soon as he was mounted." End quote. Lee immediately gave him a nickname of Colt, and he predicted that he would use it before the war was over. He described Traveler in a letter to his wife's cousin, Marky Williams, who wanted to paint a portrait of Traveler for Lee. Lee wrote, quote, "If I was an artist like you, I would draw a true picture of Traveler, representing his fine proportions, muscular figure, deep chest, short back, strong haunches, flat legs, small head, broad forehead, delicate ears, quick eye, small feet, and black mane and tail. Such a picture would inspire a poet, whose genius could then depict his worth and describe his endurance of toil, hunger, thirst, heat, and cold, and the dangers and suffering through which he has passed. He could dilate upon his sagacity and affection and his invariable response to every wish of his rider. He might even imagine his thoughts through the long night marches and days of the battle through which he has passed. But I am no artist, Marky, and can therefore only say he is a Confederate gray horse." End quote. Traveler was known to have a lot of stamina and was usually a good horse for an officer to ride in battle because he was really difficult to spook. However, he was still a horse, and sometimes he could get very nervous. At the Second Battle of Bull Run, while General Lee was at the front lines, he dismounted and was holding Traveler by the bridle. But Traveler became frightened at some movement of the enemy and, plunging, he pulled Lee down on a stump and broke both of his hands. Lee went through the remainder of that campaign mostly in an ambulance. When he did ride on horseback, a courier rode in front of him, leading his horse for him. Lee didn't hold it against Traveler, though. He understood where the fear was coming from. After the war, Traveler accompanied Lee to Washington College in Virginia. He lost many hairs from his tail to admirers who wanted a souvenir of the famous horse and his general. Lee wrote to his daughter, Mildred, that, quote, "The boys are plucking out his tail, and he is presenting the appearance of a plucked chicken," end quote. Like Ulysses S. Grant, Traveler was not Lee's only horse that he rode during the war. Lucy Long was a mare, and she was the primary backup that Lee used to Traveler. She remained with the Lee family long after the war was over and outlived Lee by a long shot. She died when she was 34 years old. She had originally been a gift from J.E.B. Stewart, who purchased her from Adam Stephen Dandridge of the Bower. Notably, she was the horse that Lee rode at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Lee also owned a horse named Richmond, who was a bay-colored stallion. He was acquired in early 1861. Unfortunately, he died in 1862 after the Battle of Malvern Hill. Lee also owned a horse named Brown Roan, or just the Roan, and he was purchased in West Virginia by Lee around the time of Traveler's purchase. Unfortunately, he went blind in 1862 and, of course, had to be retired from war at the time. Lee also owned a horse named Ajax, who was a sorrel horse, and Ajax was too large for Lee to ride comfortably in battle, and while he kept him with him, he didn't use him all that often because of his size. And not exactly one of Lee's horses, but one of his generals, James Longstreet, was referred to by Lee as his old war horse because of his reliability. After the Civil War, many Southerners were upset by Longstreet's defection to the Republican Party and blamed him for their defeat in the Civil War. However, Lee supported this reconciliation and was pleased with how Longstreet had fought in the war. Horses were deeply important to Lee. And so naming his general Old War Horse was a symbol of his trust and appreciation for someone he considered a valuable asset and friend. Traveler wasn't just a horse. to Lee. He was his partner. And in some of the Civil War's most intense campaigns, he was Lee's closest, most reliable companion. Traveler carried Lee through the rugged terrain of the Shenandoah Valley, through the blood-soaked field of Gettysburg, and he remained graceful and calm in a way that inspired both Robert E. Lee and all the soldiers in his command. One anecdote highlights Traveler's bravery when under fire. During the Battle of Malvern Hill in 1862, amidst a hail of Union artillery, Traveler reportedly refused to panic. He kept his head on straight. Lee, mounted and visible to his troops on the ground, calmly rode along the lines on Traveler, exuding a sense of control and determination. Soldiers would later remark that the sight of Robert E. Lee sitting on his fearless horse Traveler, completely unbothered by their artillery shells, steadied their own nerves and provided the bravery that they needed to continue the fight. Another tale comes from the aftermath of the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse in 1864. Lee's officers urged him to dismount and take cover as bullets whizzed by himself and Traveler, but instead he stayed sitting on Traveler, assessing the battlefield. His composure became a legend among his men, and Traveler was a huge part of that image, also standing still and unbothered by the chaos that was surrounding them. But Traveler just wasn't a steadfast, unflappable horse. He enjoyed showing his personality during quiet moments at war as well. He was known to come up and nuzzle soldiers who approached him, and Lee often spoke of the horse's intelligence and his innate curiosity. Traveler had a fondness for people, and it made him not just a favorite of Lee's, but anyone who had the pleasure of interacting with him. At the end of the Civil War in 1865, Lee surrendered at the Appomattox Courthouse, and his farewell to his army was one of the most poignant moments in American history. Of course, during the negotiation of their surrender, Lee was sitting on Traveler. Traveler was a silent witness to this really important turning point in American history. After the war, Lee retired to a private life, taking a position as president of Washington College in Lexington, Virginia. Traveler became a pretty familiar sight on campus. Lee would often bring him with him, and Traveler could be seen grazing or carrying Lee around on short rides across campus. Lee, always a Southern gentleman, often greeted students while he was sitting on Traveler. On one occasion, a young boy approached the horse and asked Lee if he could ride him. Lee, of course, smiled and helped the boy into the saddle, and enjoyed the smile spreading across the boy's face as he got to experience riding the legendary horse known as Traveler. Even in retirement, Traveler's presence brought Lee comfort. Lee described him as, quote, "my companion through the struggle of life," end quote. And many visitors to the campus remarked on the quiet bond that was evident between the two of them. In 1870, during Robert E. Lee's funeral procession, Traveler was led behind the general's casket, his saddle and bridle draped with a black crepe. Traveler's final days were marked by tragedy. In 1871, Traveler stepped on a rusty nail and developed tetanus, which was a deadly condition for horses at the time as there was no treatment. Despite every effort being made to save him, Traveler's suffering became absolutely unbearable, and he was eventually humanely euthanized. To honor Traveler and his bond with his rider, he was buried near Robert E. Lee's tomb at Washington and Lee University. Traveler's grave remains a place of quiet reflection, his story intertwined with the legacy of the man that he served. Visitors often leave apples or flowers as tokens of respect to him and a reminder of the horse's enduring place in history. The stable where Traveler lived his last days is directly connected to the Lee House on campus. It traditionally stands with its doors left open, and this is said to allow Traveler's spirit to wander in and out freely. The 24th president of Washington and Lee, thus a recent resident of Lee House, Thomas Burrish, caught strong criticism from many members of the Washington and Lee community for closing the stable gates in violation of the tradition. Burrish later had the doors to the gates repainted in a dark green color, which he referred to in campus newspapers as Traveler Green. The now defunct base newspaper of the United States Army Fort Lee, now known as Fort Gregg Adams, located in Virginia, was named Traveler. Lee and Traveler's story is a complex one, and it's especially interesting to see the similarities between Lee and Traveler and Ulysses in Cincinnati. While Lee's role in the Confederacy made him a deeply polarizing figure, it's important to remember his personal beliefs at the time were in opposition with the side of the war that he was fighting on. His bond with Traveler underscores this. It transcended the political and cultural divides of the era, just like Lee's personal opinion of slavery did. Their relationship reminds us of the timeless connection between humans and horses, and if you invest in building that relationship, it is a bond built on trust, loyalty, and mutual respect, and is powerful enough to shape history. For most equestrians, Traveler is an emblem of courage, intelligence, and grace while under pressure. His story continues to inspire horse lovers worldwide, and it serves as a reminder of the extraordinary roles that horses have played in our lives and our human history. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of Lee and Traveler. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with other fellow horse and history lovers. Don't forget that the Daily Ride podcast directly supports True Heart Healing. Head to www.the-daily-ride.com to make a donation. Thanks for joining me today. Until next time, enjoy the ride.